The news moved through the humid southern air like a storm. The master of Bellamir Plantations was dead. Behind him, he left an empire built on cotton fields, the labor of 1,000 enslaved people, and the silence of suffering. He had been one of the wealthiest men in the region, a man who never dirtied his own hands, but grew richer with every harvest season. Now, all that remained was his widow, Margaret Bellamir. The city spoke her name in whispers, mixing admiration with suspicion. She was beautiful, poised, and suddenly very powerful. At the funeral, she played her part perfectly. Black veil, trembling lips, gloved hands folded in grief. But beneath that veil, something else was awakening, something quiet and dangerous. The wealthy men of the South watched her carefully. They saw not just a grieving widow, but an opportunity. She was young, attractive, and incredibly rich. In their world, a woman like her would not stay unmarried for long. Marriage was business, after all, dressed up as romance. But Margaret had different plans. Her husband's death had given her something rare and precious. For the first time in her life, she had control. No husband to obey, no man to approve her choices. The thought both excited and frightened her. A week after the funeral, she visited the plantations for the first time as their owner. The heat pressed down on everything. Overseers stood respectfully, watching her closely. The enslaved workers stood in rows, their bodies covered in sweat, their faces revealing nothing. Margaret watched them work. She saw how their hands moved through the cotton, how their backs bent under the weight of endless labor. Her late husband had always called them property, tools for work. But standing there in the heat, she saw something different. She saw strength. She saw power held in chains. That night, sleep would not come. Her mind kept returning to those images. The men in the fields, their movements, their quiet defiance. It unsettled her, but deep inside, it also lit a fire she had never felt before. The next morning, Margaret left her mansion and went to the slave market in the city. When asked what she needed, she answered simply, "House servants," she said, "young and strong." By evening, she had purchased 10 men. Her overseers assumed they would work around the estate, maintaining the gardens and buildings. They were wrong. History books often paint Southern ladies as delicate creatures, fragile, moral, incapable of cruelty. But historians like Catherine Clinton and Stephanie Jones Rogers have uncovered a darker truth. Many white women, especially widows who inherited plantations, discovered a twisted kind of freedom in their new power. Power over land, over money, and over the bodies of enslaved men. In the weeks that followed, strange things began happening at the Bellamir estate. Servants noticed changes in their mistress. She walked the halls alone at night. She kept her new purchases housed near the main quarters, not in the fields where workers belonged. Candlelight flickered behind her bedroom curtains long into the night. Doors opened and closed softly. Heavy footsteps echoed in the darkness. The next morning, she would emerge calm and collected, almost glowing, as if the night had given her something she had been denied her entire life. This was not love. This was control, domination, the intoxication of forbidden power. For the first time, Margaret could command without consequence. She could summon a man, someone the law said was less than human, and he would have no choice but to obey her. Yet beneath that authority was something more complex, a need, a hunger, not just of the body, but of the spirit. In a world that had always denied her freedom, she found rebellion in the darkest possible way. In those quiet, candlelit nights, she became tangled in the very system that enslaved others. Every act of intimacy was poisoned by imbalance. The men she summoned could not refuse. To resist meant punishment or death. Their strength, which she admired, only emphasized her dominance. She confused control for affection, command for connection. The thrill of power became her escape from loneliness. And in that shadowed space, desire twisted into something unrecognizable. Forbidden things never stay buried for long. The whispers started small, servants gossiping quietly, overseers exchanging knowing looks. Neighbors began to notice patterns. How often she dismissed her staff, how often she traveled alone to the quarters. They wondered what really happened behind those tall white columns when darkness covered the fields. Southern society was built on silence, but silence breaks easily under the weight of sin. Margaret was not alone in this. Across the South, other widows walked the same narrow path between loneliness and desire. Women who suddenly found themselves free from husbands, but surrounded by power they had never held before. Historians later called it the paradox of the Southern mistress, a woman oppressed by men, yet complicit in oppressing others. By day, Margaret maintained appearances perfectly. She was polite, refined, charitable. She hosted church gatherings, donated to orphan funds, wrote letters about faith and loss. The performance of innocence played flawlessly. But when night fell, everything changed. Behind heavy drapes and locked doors, she became something the world would never forgive. A woman who used her power to cross every line her society had drawn. She felt both liberated and cursed by her desires. What she took in secret became her own rebellion. Yet it chained her to guilt she could not name. In her mirror, she saw the contradiction of her existence, the delicate face of a widow, the eyes of a ruler, the shadow of a sinner. She was both master and prisoner, powerful and powerless at once. Every night, she tried to command her own freedom through dominating another. Every morning, she woke to the reminder that she lived in a world built on cruelty, silence, and lies. For the enslaved men, it was a living nightmare, a quiet violence with no name. They could not fight back. To refuse a mistress was to invite death. They carried the weight of her desires as they carried the weight of field labor, silently, endlessly, without hope of release. What the world might call pleasure was, for them, another form of bondage. They became keepers of her secrets, trapped in a silence that history would never record. The plantation became a symbol of that silence. Servants learned not to ask questions. Overseers pretended not to see. The system itself was designed to protect her. White men who suspected the truth looked away. To acknowledge such things would mean admitting that the purity of their race, so fiercely defended in public, was an illusion. In the twisted order of the South, white men could do as they pleased with black women. But the idea of a white woman crossing that same line was unthinkable. So it was simply never spoken of. Among her peers, there was an unspoken understanding, a code maintained by fear, pride, and hypocrisy. Other widows lived the same way. They too acquired young, strong men and kept them close under the excuse of domestic service. They too found comfort in power disguised as passion. Sometimes these women shared knowing glances at social gatherings, a flicker of recognition passing between them like smoke. No words were exchanged. Words were dangerous. Silence was safer. Silence meant survival. As years passed, Margaret aged gracefully. Her wealth remained untouched, her secret world intact. The fields continued yielding profits. The city continued whispering, but no one could prove what happened within her walls. Her beauty softened, but her authority grew sharper, colder. She became a myth among the servants, a figure both feared and pitied. They said her heart had turned to stone long ago, that she slept in the same bed where her husband died, surrounded by ghosts of her own making. Margaret's encounters became ritual. She moved through the nights like a ghost, her steps measured, her commands soft but absolute. The men she summoned knew the rules. Speak little, obey always. The air in her chambers was thick with unspoken fear. The plantation, with its moonlit corridors and endless shadows, became a prison for everyone inside it. Not just those in chains, but also the woman who held the keys. She had escaped one cage only to build another around herself, one made of secrets, desire, and the corrupting nature of absolute power. History would later try to forget women like her, but the truth remained, buried in the soil. When emancipation finally came, the old order crumbled. The Bellamir plantations fell into decline. The enslaved were freed. Overseers left. The grandeur of the house began to decay. Margaret remained alone, her fortune fading, her secrets rotting quietly beneath the floorboards. The men who had been her instruments of power disappeared into freedom, leaving her with nothing but memories of what she had done. The silence that once protected her now consumed her. Historians rarely mention women like her. Records of such women were deliberately buried under layers of propriety and shame. Society chose to forget that in the machinery of slavery, white women were not merely victims of men's power. They were active participants in cruelty. Their hands were stained too, not only with the blood of those they owned, but with darker sins that could never be confessed. The legacy of the plantation mistress was rewritten to preserve innocence. But beneath every history rewritten by victors lies truth whispered by the oppressed. Margaret's story, like many others, was never written in official records. It survived only in shadows, in the knowing eyes of those who once served her, in the uneasy hush that fell whenever her name was mentioned. She died as she lived, in silence, surrounded by wealth that could no longer buy peace. When her estate was finally sold, no one spoke of what had happened behind those doors. The house was repainted, walls repaired, the past buried beneath layers of whitewash, both literal and moral. The South's romantic image hides this truth. Women who ruled in silence, who wielded desire as a weapon, who found in others' suffering a reflection of their own fractured freedom. Theirs was a kingdom built not only on slavery, but on secrecy, where boundaries between love, control, and cruelty dissolved into one. In the end, Margaret Bellamir's story is not just one woman's fall. It is the story of an era, of a civilization that dressed its sins in lace and called them virtue, that taught daughters to weep in public and sin in private, that built wealth on silence and morality on lies. But history has a way of remembering what people try to forget. Beneath the romance of the Old South lies the truth of its women. Women who discovered that freedom, when stolen from the suffering of others, is no freedom at all. Historians like Catherine Clinton and Stephanie Jones Rogers spent years uncovering these buried stories. They found letters, records, testimonies, fragments of truth too scandalous to be written openly. These widows were expected to uphold purity, to represent the moral superiority that white womanhood claimed in the slave-holding South. But beneath that image, behind closed doors, they acted on impulses their society denied them. The evidence was there, hidden in plantation records, in whispered family stories, in the careful gaps in official histories. Women who inherited estates and immediately purchased young men for household service. Women whose behavior changed after their husbands died, who became reclusive yet seemed strangely content. Women whose servants spoke in coded language about what happened at night. These were not love stories. They were stories of power corrupted, of desire twisted by a system that dehumanized some and elevated others. The enslaved men involved had no voice, no choice, no escape. What happened to them was rape by another name, dressed in the language of command and obedience. The plantation system created these conditions. It gave certain people absolute power over others. And absolute power, as history shows again and again, corrupts absolutely. It did not matter if that power was held by men or women. The result was the same: suffering, silence, and secrets that festered for generations. For every Margaret Bellamir whose story can be pieced together, there were countless others, unwritten, unnamed, ruling their silent kingdoms with trembling hands. They lived behind masks of mourning, moving through candle-lit halls where the only witnesses were walls. Time buried their confessions. History painted them as saints. But truth cannot stay buried forever. It breathes in forgotten records, in academic research, in memories that refuse to fade. The plantations are gone now, their fields turned to dust, their mansions to relics, but the silence remains. The past does not die. It lingers in soil, in ruins of old plantation houses, in bloodlines of those who survived. What happened in the shadows of the South was not only slavery's story. It was a story of power, of forbidden hunger, of human desire twisted by dominance. Men were chained by iron, women were chained by expectation, and sometimes when both tried to break free, their rebellion took forms too dark for history to admit. The same silence that kept so many voices unheard, so many truths untold, still echoes today. When we study history, we often see only what was written down, what was considered acceptable to record. But the real story lives in the gaps, in what was deliberately left out. Understanding this history matters, not to judge the dead, but to understand how systems of power corrupt everyone they touch, how oppression creates not just victims and villains, but complex, broken people who perpetuate cycles of harm even as they themselves suffer. The story of the plantation mistress reveals uncomfortable truths, that women can wield cruelty as easily as men, that victims of one system can become oppressors in another, that power without accountability breeds darkness, regardless of who holds it. These stories challenge our simple narratives of the Old South. They force us to see that everyone living within slavery's system was corrupted by it. Some suffered immeasurably, others inflicted suffering, many did both. The categories of innocent and guilty become blurred when everyone breathes the same poisoned air. When you listen closely to the wind passing through the South, it still carries echoes of those who had no choice, of those who thought themselves free but were prisoners all the same. If you believe stories like these deserve telling, the stories history tried to hide, help us bring them to light. Support Echoes of History by subscribing, liking, and sharing. Each voice, each memory, each truth brings us closer to understanding what really lived behind the illusion of the Old South. Because history is not just what's written in books, it is what was buried in silence, waiting for someone brave enough to dig it up and speak it aloud. The past shapes the present, and we cannot move forward until we face what really happened behind those closed doors, in those silent nights, in the empire of secrets that the Old South built and tried to bury forever.